The young Marine stood over the elderly man in the worn red jacket, voice dripping with contempt. "This is my seat now, Grandpa. Move it." The old man with his white beard and sad eyes looked up slowly but said nothing. Around them, other service members shifted uncomfortably, some smirking, others looking away. The young Marine crossed his arms, confident in his authority, certain this shabby old man didn't belong in the military base cafeteria, reserved for active personnel. What happened next would shake that confidence to its core and teach everyone present a lesson about respect they would never forget. If you believe respect should be earned through service and not demanded through arrogance, stay with this story. The man in the red jacket was named Thomas Sullivan. At 70 years old, his white hair matched his beard, both neatly trimmed despite his humble appearance. The plain t-shirt under his red jacket had seen better days, and his jeans were faded from years of wear. His face carried that perpetual sadness, that serious expression that comes from seeing too much, carrying too much weight across too many years. Thomas had been visiting the base that morning for a routine medical appointment at the VA clinic. The appointment had run long, and hunger had driven him to the cafeteria, a place he technically had access to as a veteran but rarely visited. He preferred to keep to himself, to avoid attention, to let the past stay buried where it belonged. The cafeteria was busy that Thursday afternoon, filled with young Marines in their crisp uniforms, their voices loud with the confidence of youth and training. Thomas had found a small table near the window, away from the main crowd. He'd bought a simple sandwich and coffee, nothing fancy, and had been sitting quietly, watching the autumn leaves drift past the glass. That's when Lance Corporal Derek Matthews noticed him. Matthews was 22, fresh from his second deployment, and full of the swagger that came with surviving combat and earning his place among warriors. He'd been looking for a seat, and when he saw the old man in civilian clothes occupying a table alone, something in him bristled. This was their space, he thought, their sanctuary. What was some random old guy doing here? Matthews approached with two of his buddies flanking him. The other Marines watched as he stopped at Thomas's table. "Excuse me, sir," Matthews had said, the words so dripping with sarcasm. "This section is for active duty personnel." Thomas had looked up slowly, those sad eyes meeting the young Marine's gaze. "I have permission to be here, son." His voice was quiet, measured, without challenge or anger. Matthews had laughed then, a sharp bark of amusement. Permission? From who? His buddies joined in the laughter. Thomas had simply returned to his sandwich, and that's when Matthews made his move. He reached down and grabbed the back of Thomas's chair. "This is my seat now, Grandpa. Move it." The cafeteria had gone quieter, not silent, but the volume had dropped as people began to notice the confrontation. Thomas set down his sandwich carefully, wiping his hands on a napkin with deliberate slowness. His expression hadn't changed, that same serious, sad look that seemed carved into his features. "Young man, I don't want any trouble. I'll finish my meal and be on my way." But Matthews wasn't satisfied. He wanted submission, wanted this old man to understand the hierarchy, to respect the uniform. "You'll move now, or I'll have security escort you out. Do you understand?" Around them, reactions were mixed. Some Marines looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others watched with interest, curious how this would play out. A few nodded in agreement with Matthews, thinking he was right to protect their space. Thomas stood slowly, his movements careful. The movements of a man whose body had endured more than most could imagine. He was shorter than Matthews by several inches, and the young Marine seemed to grow even more confident at the height difference. But as Thomas stood, something changed in his posture. His back straightened just slightly. His shoulders squared in a way that was almost imperceptible, but somehow commanded presence. He looked at Matthews directly, and for just a moment, the young Marine felt something flicker in his chest. Uncertainty, perhaps, but he pushed it down, refused to acknowledge it. "I served too, son," Thomas said quietly. "A long time ago, maybe before you were born, but I served." Matthews rolled his eyes. "Yeah? What were you, supply clerk? Cook?" His buddies laughed again. Thomas didn't respond to the mockery. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn wallet. From it he extracted a faded military ID card, the kind issued to retirees. He held it out and Matthews snatched it, glancing at it dismissively. "Sullivan, Thomas J. retired." "Big deal, Grandpa. Lots of people retire. Doesn't mean you get to take up space meant for real Marines." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. He simply held out his hand for the ED-back. That's when Staff Sergeant Jennifer Reyes, sitting 3 tables away, stood up. She'd been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort. "Matthews, stand down." The Lance Corporal turned, surprised. Staff Sergeant Reyes was respected, known for being fair but firm, but Matthews' blood was up now, his pride engaged. "With respect, Staff Sergeant. I'm just maintaining order. This civilian shouldn't be here." Reyes walked over, her expression hard. "He has a retired military ID. He has every right to be here. Show some respect." Matthews bristled but couldn't directly challenge a superior. He stepped back, muttering under his breath about old men living in the past. Thomas quietly gathered his sandwich and coffee, preparing to leave anyway. The confrontation had drained what little appetite he'd had, but then the cafeteria doors opened with a sharp bang that cut through the remaining conversations like a blade. Everyone turned. Base Commander Colonel Richard Hartley strode in, his uniform immaculate, his bearing radiating authority accumulated over 30 years of service. He wasn't alone. Behind him walked Command Sergeant Major Patricia Vance, and behind her 2 officers whose rank insignia marked them as high-ranking staff. The entire cafeteria seemed to snap to attention instinctively, conversations dying completely. Colonel Hartley's eyes swept the room, and they landed immediately on the scene near the window. On Matthews standing over the old man in the red jacket. On Thomas Sullivan, frozen in the act of gathering his belongings. The colonel's face went pale, then red, then pale again. He crossed the cafeteria in long, purposeful strides, and the crowd parted before him like water. Matthews suddenly realized he was at the center of attention, and not in a good way. He straightened, trying to look professional, authoritative. But the colonel wasn't looking at him. Hartley stopped 3 feet from Thomas Sullivan and did something that made every jaw in that cafeteria drop. He came to attention, spine rigid, heels together, and raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. "General Sullivan, sir." The words rang out like a gunshot in the silence. "General." The word rippled through the crowd in whispers. Matthews felt his stomach drop through the floor. Thomas Sullivan stood there, that sad, serious expression unchanged, and slowly returned the salute. His hand was steady, his form perfect despite his age, despite the worn red jacket and faded jeans. "Colonel Hartley," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying that same measured tone. "No need for formalities. I'm long retired." The colonel lowered his salute, but his posture remained rigid, respectful. "Sir, you will always be General Sullivan to me and to this entire corps. You commanded the 3rd Marine Division in Fallujah. You held that city when everyone said it couldn't be done. You brought your Marines home." The silence in the cafeteria was absolute now. Every eye was on the old man in the red jacket, seeing him completely differently. Matthews felt like he might vomit. Command Sergeant Major Vance stepped forward, and she too saluted. "General Sullivan, sir. It's an honor. I served under you in Iraq. You saved my convoy when we were ambushed. You personally led the relief force." Thomas's sad eyes shifted to her, and for the first time something softened in them. Recognition. Sergeant Major Vance. "I remember. You were wounded that day. Shrapnel in your leg." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You carried me to the medevac yourself, sir. Wouldn't let anyone else do it." Colonel Hartley turned then, his gaze sweeping the cafeteria until it landed on Matthews. The young Lance Corporal wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and cease existing. The colonel's voice was ice. Who was disrespecting the general? It wasn't a question. Matthews tried to speak, but his throat had closed. Staff Sergeant Reyes stepped forward. "Sir, Lance Corporal Matthews was unaware of General Sullivan's identity. He was attempting to enforce what he believed was proper cafeteria protocol." Her tone made it clear she was trying to provide context, not excuse the behaviour. The colonel's expression didn't soften. Attempting to enforce protocol by humiliating a veteran? By mocking his service? Thomas raised a hand slightly. "Colonel," the young man didn't know. "No harm done, but Hartley wasn't finished. With respect, General, harm was done. To you, and to the standards we hold." He turned back to Matthews. Lance Corporal, front and centre. Matthews moved forward on shaking legs, came to attention before the colonel and the general he'd just humiliated. His face was white, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, I didn't know. I'm sorry, I thought." Hartley cut him off. "You thought what?" That because a man is old and wearing civilian clothes, he doesn't deserve respect. That service has an expiration date, that you, with your handful of years, have earned the right to judge who belongs among Marines? Matthews couldn't answer. Tears were forming in his eyes now, tears of shame and horror at what he'd done. Thomas looked at the young Marine, and his expression remained that same sad seriousness, but his voice was gentle. "Son, look at me." Matthews forced himself to meet those eyes. "You made a mistake. You let pride and assumption guide you instead of respect and humility. But you're young. You can learn from this." The kindness in Thomas's voice somehow made it worse, made Matthews feel even smaller. Colonel Hartley continued. General Sullivan commanded over 15,000 Marines in combat. He held 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Silver Stars, and a Medal of Honor. He turned down a 4th star to retire and care for his dying wife. He spent the last decade volunteering at VA hospitals, helping veterans who struggle, asking for nothing in return. And you told him to move. The weight of those words crushed down on Matthews. He was crying openly now, unable to stop himself. "Sir, General Sullivan, sir, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was completely wrong." Thomas stepped forward and did something unexpected. He placed a hand on Matthews's shoulder. The young Marine flinched, expecting anger, but found only that same gentle firmness. "You'll be a better Marine for this, son. Remember this feeling. Remember that every person you meet carries a story you can't see. That respect isn't about rank or age or appearance. It's about recognizing the humanity and sacrifice in others. Can you do that?" Matthews nodded, unable to speak, and Thomas squeezed his shoulder once before letting go. Colonel Hartley's expression remained stern. "Lance Corporal Matthews, you will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. We will discuss appropriate consequences and additional training on military courtesy and respect. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Matthews managed, his voice broken. The colonel turned to address the entire cafeteria. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. General Sullivan could have had this Marine court-martialed. He could have demanded his career. Instead, he showed the mercy and leadership that made him a legend in this corps. That is what a true Marine looks like. Not the uniform, not the rank, the character, the willingness to lead with strength and compassion. Remember this day." Thomas had picked up his tray again, but Colonel Hartley took it from him gently. "Sir, please, allow me to buy you a proper meal. Join me in the officers' dining room." Thomas shook his head. "Thank you, Richard. But I think I've caused enough disruption for one day. I'll head home." But Hartley persisted, and Command Sergeant Major Vance added her voice. "Please, General, let us honour you properly. Just a meal among old comrades." Thomas looked at them both, at the respect and genuine affection in their faces, and finally that sad expression cracked just slightly. The corners of his mouth lifted in the barest hint of a smile. "All right. But only if you stop calling me General. I'm just Thomas now," Hartley smiled back. "With respect, sir, you'll always be General Sullivan to us." As they walked toward the officers' dining area, every Marine in that cafeteria stood at attention. Not ordered to, not required to, but compelled by respect and shame and understanding. Thomas walked past them, acknowledging their attention with small nods, that red jacket suddenly looking less shabby, and more like a badge of humility, of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing. Matthews stood among them, still at attention, tears still wet on his face, watching the old man he'd dismissed walk away with the base commander treating him like royalty. The lesson burned into his soul, painful and permanent. In the days that followed, the story spread through the base like wildfire. Lance Corporal Matthews became a different Marine. He volunteered at the VA hospital, spending his free time listening to veterans' stories, learning their names, treating each one with the respect he'd failed to show Thomas Sullivan. He never forgot that feeling of shame, and he never wanted to feel it again. Staff Sergeant Reyes made sure the story was told to every new Marine who arrived at the base, turning it into a teaching moment about judgment and respect. And Thomas Sullivan returned to his quiet life, visiting the base occasionally for medical appointments, always wearing that red jacket, always carrying that sad, serious expression. But now, when he walked through the base, Marines saluted. Not because they were required to, but because they knew. They knew that the old man in the worn jacket had led thousands into battle and brought them home, that he'd earned his sadness through sacrifice most of them couldn't imagine. That respect isn't about what you can see on the surface, but what lies beneath. in the heart and history of every person you meet. The cafeteria incident became legend, a story told and retold, each telling reinforcing the same message. Never judge by appearance. Never assume you know someone's worth. Never let pride blind you to the possibility that the person you're dismissing might be a hero in disguise. And always show respect, because you never know who's sitting in that seat.